The job of a waiter, like any other job, had its intricacies, and Darren knew them well. Despite his young age, he knew how to read the customers. Darren grew up in a poor family, and therefore he learned the value of money early on in his life. Nevertheless, he was never greedy and never worried too much about getting tipped. The young man loved it when his work was appreciated, and he got flattering reviews from his customers. It would all be great, but for some unknown reason, the restaurant's manager, Alfred Johnson, didn't like this pleasant young man from the moment he first met him. It's hard to say what exactly caused the manager's displeasure, but he always made snide comments about Darren and tried to humiliate him every chance he got. Knowing that the manager didn't like him, Darren always made it a point to be extremely polite in his presence. Few people knew that Darren had a secret of his own. It had to do with the little girl who recently came to New York from Ohio. Molly didn't look a day over 7, which made Darren worry about her. The waiter first noticed the girl when he accidentally witnessed her watching the kitchen worker feed the leftovers to stray dogs. She looked as if she was jealous of the dogs. It was then that Darren realized that the girl needed help. The child was probably homeless. Darren suspected that she could have run away from an orphanage, as life in an institution definitely wouldn't have been easy. Trying not to frighten the girl, Darren stepped closer and cautiously offered her his help. "I'm very hungry, sir. I'd love a small bun or a sandwich, the kind my grandmother used to make for me, with lettuce and cheese," the little girl murmured, lowering her eyes shyly. At the mention of her grandmother, Darren realized that the girl wasn't an orphan. But what happened to her? Did she run away from home? The man wondered. But he chose not to voice his thoughts and simply went into the kitchen and made a few sandwiches for the girl so that she could take them with her. "Here, take this. If you need more, come back and I'll help you. Don't be shy," Darren said, giving Molly the paper bag. Ever since then, the girl kept coming back to the restaurant almost every day. The kitchen staff didn't mind what David was doing, since he paid for everything from his own pocket. Moreover, they also felt sorry for the little girl who found herself in such a horrible situation. At first, no one could understand why Molly was living on the street or how she got there. But when the girl got more relaxed around Darren, she told him her story. As it turned out, Molly was looking for her mother, who left for New York 2 years ago and disappeared. The girl used to live with her grandmother, who owned a small farm. The girl's father died 5 years ago. So apart from the elderly grandma, there was no one to take care of Molly. And a week ago, her grandmother passed away and Molly was left all alone. The girl wanted to find her mother, so she took the train to New York. It's hard to imagine what the little girl had to go through before she arrived in New York. She only ever saw the city in pictures, and therefore, once she got to it, she was very confused and didn't know where to go. Of course, Darren understood that the girl's belief that she could find her mother in the big city was naive at best. But on the other hand, there was no way a 7-year-old child could think like an adult. That was why Darren decided to help Molly as soon as he learned her story. To begin with, he invited Molly to stay with him. Darren felt sorry for the little girl who had to spend her nights in all kinds of basements and abandoned houses. The girl's mother's name was Diana Green, but it meant absolutely nothing to the waiter. The young man understood that looking for one specific person in a huge metropolis would be no easier than finding a needle in a haystack. And how would one look for someone if they weren't even sure that person was in New York at all? After all, Diana could have easily moved to another city and settled there instead of the metropolis. Darren understood that if the social workers noticed the girl, she would soon end up in an orphanage, which would be very hard for her to get out of. To his own surprise, Darren felt very sympathetic to the little girl, who was left all alone with her problems. The young man took care of Molly with as much kindness and compassion as possible. The girl reminded Darren of his little sister, who passed away 3 days before her 18th birthday. The young man read Molly fairy tales and told her funny stories from his life. Darren even moved his TV to the girl's room so that she could watch her favorite cartoons. At this time, the restaurant was getting ready to hold an important event. A wealthy banker had decided to celebrate his wedding at the restaurant, and the date was coming up. Alfred Johnson personally oversaw all the wedding preparations. which meant that he pretty much bullied the restaurant staff around the clock. Darren had it the worst since Alfred disliked him a lot. Trying not to pay attention to the manager's nitpicking, the young man quietly did everything that was asked of him. The staff was impatiently waiting for the wedding day. All they wanted was for the horrifying preparations and the manager's never-ending reproaches to finally end. The long-awaited day had finally arrived. Dressed in elegant uniforms, the waiters scurried between the tables, trying to serve the multitude of guests. Robert Brown was considered one of the richest people in the city, and therefore he didn't hold back when celebrating such an important event in his life. There was a live orchestra playing, the divine sounds of which were sometimes interrupted by beautiful toasts to the bride and groom. Glancing towards the stage from time to time, Darren smiled and mentally wished happiness to the newlyweds. The bride's face was hidden by a veil, but the young man was sure that she was very beautiful. I doubt that such a prominent banker would have married her otherwise, the waiter reasoned. But Darren didn't really care about it all that much, since he had a fiancée of his own. Serving the guests, Darren didn't even suspect that Molly had come to the restaurant. This time, it wasn't because she was hungry though. She simply got bored and decided to go see her friend, who treated her like his little sister. It wasn't hard for the girl to get lost in the crowd and get inside the restaurant. Soon she was already inside and looking for Darren. She didn't dare to ask anyone where her friend was, trying to keep a low profile so that she wouldn't be asked to leave. It just so happened that Alfred Johnson, the manager of the restaurant, was the first one to notice her. He already knew that Darren was buying food for some homeless girl. But it was one thing to buy her food with his own money, while bringing her to the restaurant in the midst of such an important event, that was something completely different. "That's it. What does this waiter think he's doing?" the man exclaimed and headed towards the girl. But what happened just a minute later literally turned everything upside down. Having spotted the wedding couple, Molly, as if spellbound, headed towards the stage. For a few seconds, she stood there looking at the bride's face, and then she went on stage to take an even better look. Molly's behavior seemed so ridiculous that the guests simply froze in surprise. Paying no attention to people around her, the girl approached the bride and tore off her veil, after which she screamed with tears in her eyes. Mommy, I knew it was you." Robert Brown looked at his bride in surprise and then took a couple of steps back. The fact was that the man didn't even know that his new wife had a daughter. To say that Robert was shocked would be a huge understatement. "I didn't know you had a daughter. Why didn't you tell me about her?" the banker whispered. But the businessman didn't get an answer to his question because Diana was already busy hugging her daughter, whom she hadn't seen in 2 years. The truth was that she didn't know anything about her own mother's death or that her daughter was left all alone. "How did you find me, honey?" Diana asked, unable to stop crying. Molly smiled and started telling her mother all about her adventures on the train and how she survived all alone in the big city. The girl also didn't fail to mention that a couple of days ago she met a waiter who helped her out. Robert Brown carefully listened to the girl's every word. "A waiter, you say? What's his name?" the businessman asked cautiously. The little girl looked at the man and quietly answered, "His name is Darren. He is serving at your wedding today." Mr. Brown frowned and then looked around for the restaurant's manager. Alfred Johnson immediately approached the businessman like a faithful dog waiting to get a treat from its owner. Mr. Brown asked him to find a waiter named Darren. Robert turned out to be a decent man who didn't blame his wife for choosing not to tell him about having a daughter. That was partly due to the fact that the businessman couldn't have children of his own. But now he didn't only get a wife, but also a little daughter, whom he was planning on raising as his own, devoting a significant part of his time and effort to it. When Darren approached Mr. Brown, the man gave him an appraising look, after which he extended his hand and said, "Glad to meet a real man." Alfred was standing next to him and nearly choked with indignation at the businessman's words, but preferred to refrain from further comments. The man had already realized that it would only incur the wrath of the influential banker, who could ruin his life if he wanted to. But what Robert said next made Alfred feel very uncomfortable. In a tone that brooked no objections, the businessman recommended the manager to give Darren a promotion and make him an administrator, doubling his salary. "And remember, I will come back to check if you took my recommendation seriously," Mr. Brown added with a meaningful look. Still unable to believe his luck, Darren looked gratefully at the businessman, who changed his life for the better, having said just one sentence. Meanwhile, Robert Brown took his wife and her daughter by the hands and led them to the exit, where a limousine was already waiting for them. At that moment, Molly turned around and waved goodbye to the waiter, causing tears to well up in the young man's eyes. "Goodbye, Molly," Darren whispered and headed to the locker room to change. Now that he was an administrator, he no longer needed the waiter's uniform. Now, a completely new life was awaiting Darren, which would be filled with true love, honesty, and hope for a happy future.